Russia found 1,000 old tanks in Siberia. They miss when they move, but it's all that's left. After 42 months of grueling fighting in Ukraine, Russia's stocks of modern armored vehicles are low. So low, in fact, that Russian technicians are pulling out of long-term storage derelict tanks that, until now, were widely considered unfit for combat. Closely inspecting recent satellite imagery of Uralvagonzavod, open source analyst Jompy spotted something he'd long anticipated in Russian tank losses exceeded 4,000 earlier this year. That's as many tanks as Russia had in frontline service before widening its war on Ukraine in February 2022. Just like that, there are a lot of likely T-72As parked in the yards outside UVZ now. Jompy wrote, using the abbreviation for blah, 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 when tanks UVZ now. Jumpy wrote using the abbreviation for I'm gonna use that abbreviation now too. When tanks appear outside UVZ, it's usually because they're gradually being brought inside the factory for refurbishment and possibly upgrade before being shipped off to the frontline regiments, including those fighting in Ukraine. The 46-ton, 3-person T-72A isn't the oldest T-72 variant, but it's close. Just one model of T-72, the Ural, preceded the T-72 into Soviet service in the early 1970s. Russian industry produced thousands of T-72 Urals and T-72As, but much improved the T-72B with a stabilized 125mm gun, thicker armor, and a more powerful engine succeeded it in the 1980s. The older T-72s went into storage at bases such as the 349th Tank Storage Base in Russia's Topchitsky district, 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine. And there they remained for decades, useful only as sources of spare parts, until Ukrainian mines, artillery, missiles, and drones wiped out an entire generation of more modern tanks. With UVZ building just around 300 or so of the latest T-90M tanks annually, the Kremlin has had little choice but to dip into stocks of very old T-72s in order to partially replace its tank losses in Ukraine. The 40-year-old T-72Bs began arriving at UVZ by the dozens earlier this year, but there were just a few hundred T-72Bs in storage. There are around 1,000 T-72 Urals and T-72As. As recently as last summer, Hai Marsed, another open source analyst, concluded that first-generation T-72s weren't of much use as long as Russia still had some of the slightly newer but still very old T-80Bs, T-80BVs, and T-72Bs in storage. I expect that at some point they will have to create an upgrade program for these tanks. Hai Marsed wrote about the T-72As. That should be a sign that there aren't many T-72Bs, T-80BVs left in storage. The sign has appeared. The T-72Bs and other 1980s vintage tanks are running out. Now it's the T-72A's turn to fight in Ukraine on those increasingly rare occurrences when the Russians risk tanks along the drone-patrolled front line. How many of the 1,000 or so rusty early model of T-72s are still reliable after decades in open storage is unclear. It's equally unclear how much Russia will invest in their refurbishment and upgrades. The T-72As lack many of the features that makes a modern tank modern, in particular stabilized main guns that are accurate even when a tank is moving. Ukraine's oldest frontline tanks, its Leopard 1A5s, were last upgraded in the 1980s, but even they have stabilized guns. The T-72A's impending return to frontline service is the latest evidence of a steady demechanization of the Russian army as it suffers catastrophic losses in heavy equipment in Ukraine. The T-72A's resurrection doesn't mean the Russians are losing, however. What the Russian armies lack in modern tanks, it more than makes up for with manpower. These days, Russian regiments in Ukraine mostly attack on motorcycles or on foot. They suffer heavy losses, usually totaling more than 20,000 killed and wounded in a month. But with generous signing bonuses and deceptive contracts, the Kremlin manages to recruit 30,000 fresh troops a month. They fight without modern tanks, but they still fight, and they can still push back Ukraine's own manpower-starved brigades. So yeah, this article seems maybe a little bit misleading, right? It's not all they have left. They're still very much producing the new tanks, and they still have tons in reserve that are of varying degrees of quality and wear. But it does seem like if they're pulling out a whole bunch of these unstabilized main gun tanks to either send to the front lines or to scrap for parts, does show that they are at least to some degree desperate, right? I don't think that they would be doing that if they had the ability to produce as many brand new modern tanks as they wanted to. I have a hard time believing that they would be scrapping and implementing these old unstabilized gun tanks if that was the case.